Testing. Good afternoon, Prof.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to the audience. I'm really excited to be here. It's actually my first time in 4 years at Harvard, the first time I'm on the business school campus, which says something about, that's part of the conversation we're going to have about the lack of communication between those of us on the other side of the river and those of you, this side of the river. So I was actually quite surprised, to be very honest, that I was asked to speak or to moderate today because in a past life, so I would say I'm a lapsed capitalist. All right, so this is not usually my forte. In a previous life, as you heard, I began working at Forbes Africa, CNBC Africa, done my degree in accounting, and in fact, a few months after I started working is when you landed your first Forbes Africa cover. And this was a very interesting period for Africa. This was the sort of height of the Africa Rising triumphalism. It was the time of the McKinsey Lions on the Move report. It was a time of, George Aiti's famous, cheetah versus the hippo generation conversation. It was really a time in which Africa was pushing back against, Sarkozy's famous remarks that Africa had fallen off the map. And so here was the sense that Africa was really going to step onto the world stage. It was Davos, all of those different kinds of movements in that moment were really coalescing behind a strong business narrative for Africa, particularly around emerging markets. South Africa was joining BRICS, for example. Many of the fastest growing emerging markets were in Africa. And it looked like the best way for Africa to go forward was the business solution. And in particular, young people, it was often spoken about the demographic dividend, or on the other hand, it was about the ticking time bomb. And so what I find quite interesting is that over time, I think we have maybe a good 10 years since the height of that narrative, there seems to be perhaps some sense of disillusionment. For young people, for example, in my country, South Africa, where I come from, as well as Zimbabwe, we had the fees must fall, roads must fall movement that decidedly, young people were always understood to be apathetic about the country, but all of a sudden there was a real existential crisis for the country, and particularly pushing back against the Rainbow Nation, pushing it back against neoliberalism and the discontents in that country. There was also the Marikana massacre, for example, which really put into sharp relief the problems of neoliberal capitalism in the country, and particularly for poor black people. This is not only unique to South Africa, we're also looking at countries like Nigeria as well, where last year we had the EndSARS movement, where young people are clearly demanding answers from a previous generation. And at this point, again, we're seeing Mali pushing back against neocolonialism, imperialism of France as well in the country. And so we have to then think, does business have the answers that young people are demanding in this moment?
All right, I think you will understand if, before I address your question, like all good Nigerian men married to Ghanaian women, especially Ghanaian women who one met in front of the steps of the Baker Library just down the road, you will
I'm going to go there soon.
You will understand if my opening statement is to pay a very special greeting to the Ghanaian delegation that came here, to all the Ghanaians that are in this room today, and to tell you how much deep respect and great affection and love I have for all of you. You will understand that that will secure a very pleasant evening for me. Not to have South Africa in any way left out, I would like to pay a very special greeting to the Deputy President of South Africa, who has done so much for the African cause, who has done so much for the cause of women, and who makes our entire continent feel very proud. Thank you so much. And then finally, not to be outdone, a very special greetings to Charles, who I will be introducing tomorrow, the CEO of the Kenya Commercial Bank. And for all of those who come from East Africa, I'd like to also pay all of you a very special welcome indeed. Last but not the least, I must acknowledge Professor John Makomba, who is in this room here. John has sustained Africa on this campus for well over 10 to 15 years, long before I came here. And I think it is fitting that we recognize the contributions he has made, he continues to make, and will be making in the future as well. Thank you so much, John. Now to your question. First, I will say to you that the cover on Forbes, in which I appeared, came at a very embarrassing moment for me, because I had just made a speech earlier in which I had said that Africa should not be judged by the number of well-to-do people who appear on the cover of Forbes magazine, but instead it should be judged by what happens to the bottom 40% of the population on the continent, what happens to those who are poor not because they do not have ability, but poor because they do not have opportunities. What happens to those who are in public schools, which do not have the teachers and do not have the facilities? And is it fair for them to be measured against those individuals who go to private schools and whose parents can afford for them to come to Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard Business School? That is most unfair. And therefore, when we look at the question of success, we have to have a much broader and deeper idea of what success constitutes than being on the front of Forbes magazine. So when 3 or 4 days after I made that speech, I appeared on the front of Forbes magazine cover, I have to say to you that it was a very embarrassing moment in my life. So thank you for bringing it up again. But in all seriousness, I genuinely think that there has been on the African continent an over-celebration of wealthy business folks. There has been an over-celebration. And it's important that young people understand that this is a comparatively new phenomenon. Because certainly when I was a young person, we celebrated those who fought for independence and went to jail because of independence, those who fought the great legal battles which kept land that Africans owned and was in many ways taken away from them, those who were the first great academics that founded the first universities in Africa, those who were the first doctors that addressed the health problems of most Africans, and most of us measured ourselves by the contributions that we were going to make to the community. And when I made my own application to Harvard Business School, my application said that, what is your ambition? And I wrote that I really would like to be the CEO of a state corporation in Nigeria, because I believe that it is the state corporations that are going to make an impact on development in my country, and the state oil corporation will be one of great importance, and that the decisions that are taken by the leaders of that corporation will have a huge impact on the continent, on the country, and on the continent. And that therefore I want to come to Harvard Business School to possess the tools, to understand the economics, to understand the financing, to understand the marketing, in order for my country to be able to negotiate on equal terms with the foreign multinationals, and hopefully on the basis of that, creating the revenue foundation for a greater Nigeria and Africa. That was my application form to HBS. Now, a lot has happened since then, obviously. A lot has happened. But frankly speaking, as I get older, if anything, my views are even stronger, that while I think that private business has a role to play, our role is somewhat limited. We have an important role to play in that sense, to set up the companies, the small businesses, the medium-sized businesses that deliver goods and services in very efficient way. And for example, when we look at the provision of services in banks, and the kinds of things that have happened in the banks, especially I would say in the East African banks, and in Kenya in particular, there's no doubt that those banks have made the lives of individuals, of farmers, much easier and much better. And in that respect, they have made a big contribution to the welfare of their societies. And so the same, I would say, in other countries in which you spent beforehand 14 days to transfer money from Lagos to Kaduna, or 14 days to transfer money from Accra to Cape Coast. We now do it in minutes. This has helped the burden of the society. But that said, ultimately, we need to have a more efficient, a more effective state. Because, and I think that we had a similar comment that was made by our dear Deputy President, that the private sector on its own, I don't think can successfully educate the millions of people that need to be educated in the primary schools and in the state secondary schools. They can build great private schools for a small group, and I confess that I have participated in that, though I've tried to justify to myself in saying that we give scholarships for half of the students who are there, but that's still not enough. Yes, the private sector can build great private hospitals, and there are many of those all over Africa right now, but ultimately we're really talking about a public health system that enables the children of servants, enables poor farmers to be able to cure their problems of malaria, the problems they have from bad water, the problems that they have of COVID. And COVID, I think, made this very clear. So I think that as I grow older, and I'm now 67, if there's something I believe even more strongly, it is that the argument before, which was business must take over and the state must retreat. The government that governs best is the government that governs least. I think that approach is wrong. I think there's a role for an effective private sector, but I believe that we've got to make the state more efficient, more effective, because it's got to deliver goods that only the state can deliver. And I think for that reason, the government sector has to be paid, employees have to be paid far better than they're being paid right now. I'll conclude this answer by saying something that maybe is not very fashionable to say right now in the United States. So God save me if this is the last job I have. But I think that we need to borrow, and we need all to learn from China, which is a largely state-run system, but has probably in 2 generations uplifted a larger number of people from poverty in such a short space of time, and done it more effectively than any civilization in world history. That is not to say that China does not have that's not to say China has all the answers. There are many answers in the United States, there are many answers in China, but I think we have to learn from both in order for us to have more effective states that will sort out the kinds of problems of growth with equity that you are talking about.
So while we speak about the state, I do want to make sure we just zone in a little bit more on business and make sure that's not let off the hook. As the former Deputy President, Phumzile Mncamo, excuse me, I've been in the States for too long, you just mentioned that there's a loss of trust in government, but there's also a loss of trust in business. Rightly so, because we often love to talk about how corrupt African governments are, but we don't talk enough about how corrupt businesses are in Africa and how corrupt capital is. is in Africa. In many countries, I'll speak about South Africa, where I grew up mostly. We can talk about the state collusion case, or the collusion cases within price fixing in bread, for example. We can talk about construction companies. We can talk about consultancies being implicated in state capture. Very serious cases where business is implicated in corruption of the state. How do we then begin to make sure that business is also accountable and it's not just a story of corrupt African governments?
Yes. I don't think that business or businessmen are necessarily more honest or more dishonest than government officials. And what I often argue is that to pose it as a question of corruption in business, corruption in the government is the wrong way. I think that there is corruption which is often perpetrated by a joint venture. That joint venture usually consists of a government official and a private businessman. And they work together extremely well, and you find that they rarely have ethnic problems amongst each other. All right? So that happens, all right? And therefore, I will never be one to say that private businessmen are necessarily more honest. I mean, look, if you just examine the books of some companies in Africa, you will see the valuation of a company remain stagnant for years, and yet you will see that the owners of the company, for some reason, end up being richer than the valuation of the company. Obviously, there's something going wrong there. That cannot be possible. So it is important that we hold all businessmen, myself included, we must be held accountable. And the problem is that the regulatory agencies that have to do that do not always do their jobs. At a certain part in our nation's history, they were the problem in that they exercised too great a control on private business. And I myself, in many ways, have been a victim in that situation. But I hate to say it now, and I hate to speak well of some regulatory agencies, but I do have to admit now, what we often have, and I see this particularly in my own country, Nigeria, is the reverse situation in which the private business groups now are in control of the regulatory agencies, and therefore the regulatory agency cannot enforce the needed rules that are necessary for the economic system to make progress. So without a shadow of a doubt, what you say is correct. Now, that's one. The second problem I think we have, and it's important that we solve it, is that too many times a lot of private businessmen and young students celebrate groups of people that we now call in Africa, or certainly in Nigeria, we call them the oligarchs. Mm-hmm. And depending on your point of view, I don't know who is part of that group or who is not part of the group. But I think that we are at the stage in our country in which we now have to start thinking about the rules of competition. Right? Because there's no doubt that there's a huge first mover advantage in business. We see this playing out in Nigeria in particular, in other African countries, in which you have a technology sector largely understood by young people, but you see it in the way in which those business groups that are already entrenched are doing a lot to prevent those groups from coming forward. Obviously, the younger groups have to fight that battle, but even more important, I think, is that we need to have antitrust regulation in many African countries to ensure that the existing structure of power in business is not allowed to perpetuate itself, and that we can have serious competition.
One thing I find quite interesting in what you said earlier was that, we need to change, the structure of opportunity. And it's always quite interesting to hear folks in business often frame it as problems of opportunity or lack thereof, and there's not really talk of questions of justice, for example. So is poverty a question of opportunity, a lack of opportunity, or is it a question of a lack of justice? So what I mean by that is there can be sort of intra-national questions of justice. So for example, we're looking at land reform in countries in Southern Africa, for example. So poverty is not just a lack of black people's opportunity, it's black people do not have access to the resources that were historically stolen, right? Also looking at, I mean, right now we had the royal family going around in, one couple of the royal family going into the Caribbean and they're talking about reparations. Namibia this year, over the last couple of years, has been speaking or has been demanding reparations from Germany for colonial genocide and the continued underdevelopment of that country. And very importantly, what was quite interesting is that they were offered economic development aid and they rejected that, saying we want reparations in particular because this is a question of justice, not just aid. So how do we then begin to reframe some of these issues, particularly, again, we're looking at things like, Francophrique, for example. Is it just a question of, Britain is going to say, we're going to build you more prisons, as opposed to we're going to pay and recognize that there is a historic injustice and we need to address that, as opposed to just, we're going to give you more opportunities to compete with us in the global economy.
All right. I'd like to tackle the questions you've asked in three segments. The first is just to address what I think ought to happen. And then secondly, then to address the issue of what I think is likely to happen, because they are two separate questions. So when you come to discuss the issue of what I think ought to happen, without a shadow of a doubt, there's an element of justice that is related to poverty. Obviously, there's some people who believe I am rich because I'm hardworking. You are poor because you are dumb and you are lazy. And that economic philosophy is there among a lot of people. Obviously, if you are doing well, it is very pleasing to your soul and to your heart to believe that you got there by your sheer hard work. Now, that is not to say that it isn't true that some people are lazier than others. But I think that it is obvious to me that you are there because a large element of it is because you've had better opportunities than others. So I think that in any society, in any community, there are certain rights, there are certain issues of justice. There are certain claims that every individual should be able to make, and which basically have to do with education, health, water, electricity, and so on and so forth. And the central question that we all need to address is what kind of economic system can deliver those goods for the community?
Is that capitalism?
Right? Now, I don't think that it is useful to use labels, all right, because when you look at what we call today, what is called capitalism, and you look at what obtains in Sweden, Norway, France, the United States, and all of these countries, there are huge variations in what they do, in how they provide health. And I think that the use of the word you're capitalist or you're socialist, it inflames the problem, whereas what I'd rather talk about is what measures do we take in order to gain certain objectives. That's how I would rather talk about it. So I think it's a matter of justice that I agree with you, these are the kinds of things we should do. So that's one question. And there's a second question which you asked, which has to do with, I think it's issues of land or issues of reparations. And what I'd like to say is that, you see, in Africa, we are in different areas in the following sense. The question of land in Africa is most central in Southern Africa. And that's because in Southern Africa always had a large settler community. In fact, a settler community that has been there for 200 years in South Africa that you don't know whether you can still call them
300
years. So the question is, can you still call them settlers? All right? But at the same time, having grabbed land and resources to themselves, it is almost impossible to attain justice for the black population without them giving up part of that. And any other solution really is not to confront the problem. So that is, the South African problem is a severe problem and can't just be addressed by saying they have these rights and they should keep them. Right, so that's that. Now, in East Africa, there's also a settler problem. It's not as bad as Southern Africa, okay, because the groups of people were smaller, okay, and therefore each of the countries in East Africa has had to address the issue of, do they keep their land? Do they keep their hold over business? How do we handle that? Now, in East Africa, because the numbers were smaller, it was a little easier to address the problem. And Eastern African countries came to independence in 1960s and the 1970s when it was easier to nationalize. All right? Therefore, nationalization as an economic philosophy was easier. And so a lot of the East African countries went through that route. Now, if today you announced the government is nationalizing Anglo-American, there would be a stupendous uprising. But that's what East Africa did, all right? And then we come to West Africa, which as a result largely of the mosquito, all right, never had a large settler class, all right? We didn't have proximity to Asia, therefore we didn't have an Indian population, but we had the mosquito, so we didn't have a large European population, frankly speaking. Now, therefore, in West Africa, it was much easier for business groups to move in, indigenous business groups, because we didn't have as many barriers as there were in East Africa and in Southern Africa. And therefore, the issue of things like reparations, land ownership, you will find not present in West Africa. So I think that each part of Africa has to deal with the problems that it faces, but we have to understand how it has arisen, and we've got to solve it in a manner that ensures that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, then the last part of it was, what do I think is likely to happen? I think that we are going, in each of these areas, there's going to have to be a bargain. A bargain which, how determined the political class is, how unified the groups are, will determine how far the indigenous groups can go in striking a bargain that is just and fair to the African population or the black population, but at the same time accepts that foreign capital and the capital of settlers also will have to play a role in the future of the countries. Now, I have to say that when I first visited South Africa in 1994, I looked at my dear wife because on her 40th birthday, the present that I gave her was to visit South Africa. And the reason why I did that, it was because a professor of mine, when I was at university, said to me that he didn't think it was ever going to be possible for me to visit South Africa in my lifetime because there'd never be freedom in South Africa during my lifetime. And so come 1994, and I was able to visit there, I just had to do it, just to prove a point, if anything else. All right? But I have to say that as I got to South Africa, what struck me, was the huge scale of the problem. Because I think that when you're in West Africa, you kind of think, oh, the South African issue is a little bit like ours. No, 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 no. It's a much bigger problem. You have a much more, a larger problem, a more entrenched power structure that the black population has to overcome. And I think that in that regard, we have to be very sensitive to it and to understand that that struggle is going to take a long time, but that it's a struggle that has to be done and won.
I don't know how many of you are big on social media, but there was an interesting conversation that had happened earlier this year. I can't remember what exactly the hashtag was, but it was with one Tariq Nasheed. And it was a Twitter space. It was over 20,000 Africans for almost 12 hours, so it was basically a night vigil around the question of African immigration to America, and particularly, does it benefit African Americans? Because of course we've seen in the post-independence era so much of a growth in African diaspora leaving and coming to America, going across, leaving the countries because of the lack of opportunities and a whole range of discontents of the post-independence era. But one of the things that was quite interesting in this conversation about, which really comes down to labor market disparities, the ways in which different migrant groups are pitted against local groups, is that it had so many parallels to many different conversations around competition between various black groups, whether it is Dominicans and Haitians, whether it is Ghanaians and Nigerians, whether it is black South Africans and African nationals, for example, and this way in which we are forced to compete under the ravages of global racial capitalism. Workers are straining, and black workers in particular are straining under global racial capitalism. And ultimately, because we don't have the language for or the understanding for what is happening, we begin to bear the brunt of each other's frustration and anger. And in particular in this conversation, there were kind of, people making comments like, I come to America, we work hard, you African Americans don't want to do 1, 2, 3. The African Americans, are also quite frustrated about the ways in which they are undermined in the marketplace. And again, what was interesting about the conversation is that it's not new and it's not unique to America. You see this happening time and time again. Again, right now in South Africa, you have Operation Dudula, which is against, so-called foreign nationals, because you can't be foreign if you're an African person on the African continent, but this is what people are doing under the face of, or in the face of high rates of competition. What then is the response to business when we see that kind of labor market disparity that begins to divide us as black people across the world?
I will make 2 comments about that. And the first is that I don't think that the divisions, misunderstandings between African Americans and Africans, and you can sometimes between West Africans and East Africans, or West Africans and Southern Africans, is necessarily due to a conscious policy of divide and rule. Though in the past there have been elements of it, I don't think it's now. I think that there is a genuine misunderstanding of the different groups by each other. And I think that it is of fundamental importance that each of our groups understands each other. And I'll give you an example. For most West Africans or East Africans, you grow up as a Nigerian or as a Ghanaian or Zimbabwean or South African, and then the first time you probably have run up against other Africans when you go to university. And often it's in the UK. And I remember the very first time us Nigerians, we got to London and we met the other Africans. First thing that we noticed about our brothers from East Africa was that they almost always wore suits and ties, and they loved their tea in the afternoon. So we've all thought about them of being horribly colonial all the time. And then, of course, we ran into some South Africans and African Americans, and they were constantly talking about the racial war and about black power. And for us, a lot of the Nigerians, we were saying, look, we just came here to do a degree and enjoy, enjoy, Fela Kuti, have a good time. Why, what's the problem? And of course, the Nigerians regarded the Ghanaians as, they think they're graceful, and the Ghanaians regarded the Nigerians, these crude Texans, lots of money but no class. I mean, they didn't say it that way, but there were elements of that that came through. And these kinds of stereotypes, they still remain till today. And you still see it. The African students here will say, the African Americans, they just keep going on and on and on about racial problems. Is it not enough? And so on and so forth. And the African Americans will often say, these Africans, they don't seem to care about the problems of injustice that we've suffered. All they're interested in is just getting jobs. And the Africans say, why not? All right? Okay, so you will see this happening, and it's there, and I'm sure all of you recognize what I am saying this bluntly. You see, I think it is important that each of the groups understands the history, where you are coming from, and it goes back to the following. Of all these four groups, West Africans in particular often simply do not appreciate the sheer brutality of the slave system, of what the African Americans have gone through. And in that regard, we are remarkably insensitive. All right? And we do not appreciate the brutality of apartheid and what South Africans have gone through. We kind of think that what they went through was a little bit like our independence battle in Nigeria and Ghana and West Africa, and we don't really understand why it took them so long. Whereas each of us is the culmination of a certain history. All right? And so whereas the African coming to the United States has grown up in an environment in Africa that is supportive, that has role models, that has uncles, aunts who are reassuring him and who are constantly telling him, you're better than all those guys you're going to meet when you get to Harvard. They don't know it, but you know it. Whereas the individual who's coming from South Africa or the United States isn't getting that degree of support. And therefore, they have different reactions to different things. And therefore, I genuinely believe that the starting point for all of us is to understand each other, understand where we're coming from. And if we do that, and we begin to work together, then I think that we can build not only a better Africa, but I also think that we can together make a stronger contribution within the United States.
I think quite an emotive issue for many Africans, and I think it really puts the issue of race, and particularly global anti-blackness, at the fore, was, the Ukraine issue. Ukraine issue. Seeing Africans, mothers with babies being denied entrance onto trains in the midst of war. That was, for those of us who grew up in Southern Africa, that's not surprising, but it's still shocking to see it in real time, to see it happening on a screen like that, right? It's something that, in as much as it might be real, but it's very shocking to see. And I think it really was. It was an important moment, even just looking at social media, that's one barometer of seeing the kind of conscientization. And a friend of mine who's Somalian made a really important remark to say, well, I think we've regressed in our consciousness as Africans, that it took something like this for us to realize that anti-blackness is global. I don't think you would have asked Achebe if anti-blackness is global, when he was speaking to Baldwin, for example, or Wole Soyinka. People would have understood that. What do you think is different about this particular moment where we don't seem to have that kind of common understanding of each other's struggles? Is it to do, for example, with the fact that the school over across the river does not speak to the school here? Is it because we no longer are serious about history? For example, what is the difference between that post-independence or immediate post-independence generation and this current moment where we don't see each other in each other's struggles?
Okay, I think, thank you very much for the question first, but I think that it stems from the fact that you have a problem which looks insurmountable. You solve the problem, or you think you solve the problem. And then something happens that makes you wonder, did I really solve that problem? The truth of the matter is that you have made some progress in solving the problem, but you have not solved it completely. And there are vestiges of the problem that still remain. So, for example, my father's generation. My father was a gynecologist, first doctor in our hometown, went to Howard University in the United States, then went on to McGill, Canada, and then comes back to Nigeria. And so for his generation, independence was great, right? And as far as that generation was concerned, independence largely solved a lot of the problems. And then our generation comes here, and of course, we encounter some and many forms of discrimination here, which we are livid about. My father's generation looks at us and says, I mean, what are you complaining about? We were not even allowed into the university. And you're complaining because some teacher addressed you and you say that you are hurt by it, all right? Come on, wake up and be serious, all right? And then you then make progress, all right? You get over that. And then you have two defining events for the population, for the African population or the black population. There's the election of Obama and there's the release of Mandela. And I think that there's probably nobody in this room who can't remember the picture of Mandela walking with Winnie next to him. It's a picture that will remain in the minds of every person all over the world. And then, of course, the picture of Obama. I remember Obama because I turned to I think I called my wife or my daughter and said, you know, for the first time in 30 years, tears came to my eyes when Obama was elected president of the United States. And someone said to me, not when your daughter was born, sort of thing. But it was an emotive, okay. And then after that, we see that there are still problems. Now, that should not discourage us. All it should tell us is that the struggle is continuing. So I think that the events that we have seen in Ukraine, the fact that black refugees are treated differently from other refugees, the fact that it's not in people's consciousness as much as refugees from Ukraine are being treated the way, and they're being welcomed, it's just a reminder that that battle is still on. And I think we are all outraged and upset because we had all thought that we had traveled further than we have in fact traveled. And I think that's what's happening there.
I know we need to leave soon, but I just want to go back to what we highlighted right at the beginning. Yourself as a professor here, you teach an Africa Rising course. Ironically, we also have an Africa Rising course in the humanities, which is quite different than it is here. Speak to us about this seeming division where the professional schools don't speak to the humanities, for example. The humanities don't speak to the professional school. We're almost hermetically sealed. What business does seems to be a completely different world to the philosophical questions that people are asking across the river, and vice versa. What do you think accounts for that, and what is the cost of that division? And particularly, just let me ask this question. In business, we often talk about innovation. Is there a difference between innovation and imagination?
All right, you've asked a lot of questions.
I'm sorry, I'm clearly a PhD.
I'll do my best. The first point I'll just make is that I'm not sure I'm qualified. I've only been here for a couple of years to talk about...
I'm sure you are. Everyone, I hear stellar reviews of your classes.
To discuss the various divisions at Harvard, but I think that I will throw it back and just say to the students here, if there are these divisions, you need to do something about it as students, and I will inform the students that when I came here in 1978, there was no Africa Society at the business school. There was no Africa Society at the university, and one of the first things I was involved in was I chaired the meeting of African students throughout the university that set up the constitution of the first Africa Society here. And being a good Nigerian, we decided that the Kenyans should have the presidency of the society. The Nigerians should take the treasurer position. The lady who took the position of social secretary went to the Ghanaians, and that went to a lady who later became my wife. And then the position of secretary again went to the Nigerians. The law school took the presidency, the business school took the treasury position, the college took the secretary, and the law school also took the position of social secretary. Now, since that time, let's face it, the African students at Harvard no longer meet together. The students at the business school meet in one go, the students at the law school...
We come for their jollof and parties.
No. And so I would throw it back at you and simply say that I think that the African students and the African American students throughout the university should make a point about meeting more often together, learning more often together, because I think that in the long term, it will be extremely good for harmony amongst all of you. I will just end, all right, because I know we're running out of time. Just to say to all of you, look, please, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. A big thanks to the organizers of this conference. Having organized several of these things myself, I know that you are all behaving like swans. And by swans, I mean you're looking very gracefully above the water while paddling furiously underneath. But as a person who was the only African out of 800 students when I came in 1978, all right, that an African event can fill the whole of this room fills me with immense and intense joy. Thank you very much.